This is Commissioner Margulies. I want to ask one more question to the city, which has to do with the City of Los Angeles landscape ordinance and the requirement for the number of trees required based on the number of parking spaces. Is there any particular reason why this project would receive relief from the ordinance and its requirements?
This is Henry Chiu of the Planning Department. The condition number 1, which reads all other use, height, and area regulations of the municipal code and all other applicable government regulatory agencies shall be strictly complied with in the development and use of the property, except as such regulations are herein specifically varied or required. They haven't requested any deviation from the landscape ordinance, so when they come in and they do not meet that requirement, they'll be required to file any appropriate request to deviate from the landscape ordinance, or they can submit some revised plans to show compliance with it. The commission has the authority to add conditions on this to specify compliance with the landscape ordinance, but condition number 1 requires them to be subject to all applicable regulations, including the landscape ordinance.
Well, why would we need to add a condition for that if that is just like any other requirement?
Right, so they will be required to comply with all applicable regulations.
This Commissioner Margulies, this is one of those moments when we've had them before in this commission about, and actually I have to say, like when it comes for whatever reason, I mean, we've heard a lot of testimony here tonight about the importance of the environment in our city and the goals of the general plan to restore and enhance habitat. Mm-hmm. And yet when it comes to the thing that is probably most valuable and meaningful in that effort, the landscape, the living vegetation, this is the thing that is consistently left to some future date to come back and make sure it complies. And I guess I would make a plea and a request to the planning department not to let that go, and not to, because in my calculations, I'm not seeing one new tree for every 4 spaces that are located, at least in the, I have 282 spaces and I see 48 shown, but when I do my math, which is the old math, I get 70 trees required. That's not, even close. So I'm concerned that the planning department is kind of letting folks off the hook, assuming that they're going to come back somehow magically and comply with a city ordinance. So that was my question. Thank you.
Okay, having said that, we will go into commission deliberation. I think that was a good transition there. I think we got some comments out there to start thinking about. All right. Anybody want to lead us off? You want me to lead us off?
Sure, go ahead.
Lead us off? All right. I'll lead us off. First of all, thank you again, everybody on both sides. A lot of passion, a lot of intelligence. These are always tough issues that we're dealing with. We've been here for 3 hours, obviously, and we could have gone. Well, that's true, but we started at 5 on this particular item.
That's true.
So 3+, but who's counting? As you all know, folks who come here often, the first thing I say is, is what is the standard of review? Try and look at these things as factually, judicially as possible, and not to let too much subjective get in the way of what we do up here. That's generally how I treat these items, all items we see. We have an error and abuse of discretion here.
No, you
standard.
do not.
Hold on, hold on. Whether we do or not is really not the point, but actually I'll ask the city attorney for what is our standard of review there.
Thank you. Okay. So as decision makers, your standard of review here is you are de novo decision makers. Now, in each of the entitlements here for the findings, there are requirements that in addition to the findings that you have to make, if you are going to overturn, you have to make an additional finding as to where there was an error. However, you are de novo decision makers. You look at the record anew, and you are the final decision maker here. So I just want to make that clear.
Absolutely. But the point I'm trying to make is that if we're going to overturn something that the ZA has done, we need to find some error somewhere. That is a very tough standard. Appellants are always at an inherent disadvantage in front of us because of that standard. Having said all of that, and that's usually where I come out on most of these issues, and I feel like I'm fairly consistent about it. However, in this case, I think there's some compelling arguments as to where errors were made. And I'll list them out here in no particular order, and I encourage my fellow commissioners to weigh in. First of all, I think it's very hard to avoid the fair argument standard here on why an EIR would be triggered. Even when experts disagree, I found Mr. Vanderhook extremely compelling. The man clearly knows his stuff. I found Ms. Reed very compelling. I found Somas very compelling. I think they know their stuff also. Both of those experts, so to speak, know a lot more than anybody here on the panel does. And I feel like that alone makes a strong argument for why there may be a fair argument here under CEQA that an EIR should be triggered. I think that's the first place to start. Number two, under the Bolsa Chica decision, I find it a bit of a stretch that this would be man-made, or even that Bolsa Chica necessarily says that replacement wetlands are okay if you have man-made property here. Here you have a strip of land which has been, fairly natural, as much as the other side of the 90 freeway has been, as far as anybody can tell. Yes, the 90 freeway ran through it. Yes, you had the development, and now you have this awkward strip of land which does not meander and is somewhat less than natural. Having said that, does it take it out of being a wetland delineation? I'm not sure that it does. Again, I'd go back to the fact that I think there is certainly a fair argument as to the issue. If we get into zoning, I was unclear as to whether there was an argument over the zoning here. I'm glad we all agree that it's A1. Certainly public parking would be allowed. I think that it may be a stretch that this is public parking. I certainly understand the arguments. That's why I asked it. I don't know that I would find an error on that issue, but it certainly does make me think about it. Further along, what I would say is that, and this does not go to the error issue. I think really my main error or potential error issue, and I'd like to hear from my other commissioners, I may be missing something, I think goes to the fair argument issue. But there was a lot about, HOAs which are in favor or opposed. That type of thing is important. It is important to this commission. The community is what matters. You people are here because you're real people, and we're not deciding things in a vacuum. But it's not relevant, as far as I can tell, under any of the standards we're looking at. Either the HOA is for it or against it. It was nice to hear, but I don't know that that is a relevant metric or standard upon which we're reviewing. Second of all, the homelessness issue. Again, a very real issue here around the country, around the county, around the city. Does homeless mitigation go to any of the standards that we're reviewing here? I don't think that it does. I also think a compelling argument is made is when you own your property, secure your property the best you can. I know Toyota has tried. Look, I live in the area. I've seen this dealership forever. These are good people running it. It's a good dealership with a good reputation. This is nothing to disparage Toyota. But I do not think that the presence or lack thereof of homeless people is part of the standards we're reviewing right now. What I would also I'll get to that in a second. Exiting the lot is still of a concern to me. I asked the question specifically. I appreciated the expert coming up and talking about that. I think at even 25 to 33 trips an hour, depending on when it's peak on or off in that intersection, is potentially extremely problematic. Part of that is just that I live there and I've driven it a billion times over the last 25 years. I think that is an issue. Is that necessarily an error? I don't know that I would say that because I'm not an expert on it. I'm not positive there. Again, I think the error comes back to the fair argument. And then my final issue is, if we're looking at, again, what experts think about this, and is there a disagreement, and is there a possible fair argument, the fact that we have a letter from Mr. Posner saying that it's viewed as wetlands, I think is also somewhat instructive here. I think it's hard to ignore that. So at the end of the day, as rare as it is for me to find an error on the part of the zoning administrators, I am inclined, at least on the fair argument issue, as to triggering EIR under CEQA to find that there was an error there, and to grant the appeal. Those are my preliminary thoughts.
This is Commissioner Roseman. I'll jump in here. Definitely want to say thank you to the community, both sides, for coming out and taking an active role in planning the future for Los Angeles. It's a huge testament to show that everyone cares about this land as it currently sits. I think the definition of this space as a wetland has been really, it's evidenced by both sides. Both sides have acknowledged that this is a wetland space. I think that the feasibility of constructing a parking lot while not disturbing the wetland space is not quite reasonable or doable. The buffer between the wetland space and the proposed parking lot is just not big enough. There will be impacts to this defined wetland space. I think that there's a couple of issues with regard to the CEQA initial study and checklist. I'm no expert. I have never filled out a CEQA checklist, but I do take issue with several of the categories and the impacts to both the wetland and the community with regard to view, noise, light, clean air, aesthetics. I think the impact is great to both the wetland and the community. So I would, definitely appreciate a second review of the impacts there. I think that the EIR would be the remedy to finding what the specific impacts are here to both the community and the wetland.
Sure, Commissioner Watts-Morocco. So this commission has received a lot of information this week on all the three cases that were in our packet, and normally what I do is I take a quick look at the cases and sort of get an idea of what it is, and then let it sit in my brain for a few days and then go back and dig in. And to be honest with you, when I looked at this, I thought, oh, it's a little strip of land, it's right next to the freeway, it sounds like a very reasonable use for a parking lot for a Toyota dealership, and in my mind, when I just took a quick glance and put it away, I thought, it sounds reasonable to me. But then I looked deeper. I think you just can't be kind of a wetland. And I think that's what the applicant was trying to say. Well, we've got a little bit of a wetland here, but don't worry about that. I think you are a wetland or you're not a wetland. And this, in my opinion, based on the testimony and the materials that I've read, is a wetland. So if this is a wetland and you're in the coastal area and you've got ponded water or hydric soil or wetland plants and you're in the coastal area, that means that one of those things have to happen, not all three, and obviously we're there, right? So that means, if you take all that I believe we are in violation of the Coastal Act, which is 30233, no diking, no filling, no dredging, right? I believe we are in violation of 30240B, which talks about degrading adjacent sensitive habitat areas. I think we are 30242, which is converting land that's suitable for agriculture into a non-agricultural use. There's been no evidence that this is not a feasible use. Agriculture is not feasible there. And then if you go there, then you must say that the 1222 is in violation because we're not satisfying coastal, right? This may be a less intensive use than a multifamily, but I just don't buy the fact that building a parking lot is going to solve a homeless issue for the villas. The villas need to take that on, and somebody said that, very smart woman said that you should raise your hands and take care of that. You shouldn't rely on a parking lot to take care of that for you or trade that for a parking lot. I also think that the findings for the CUP, with great respect to planning, are inadequate or in error, because I don't believe that the project will enhance the built environment in the surrounding neighborhood or perform a function or provide a service that is essential or beneficial to the community. And I also don't believe that the project's location, size, height, operations, or other significant features will be compatible and will not adversely affect or further degrade adjacent properties, the surrounding neighborhood, or public health, welfare, and safety. Look, after all of this, it seems clear to me that the benefit here is to Toyota. And I think Councilman Bonin said it so eloquently that we really need to support this appeal.
As Commissioner Margulies, I'm in agreement with all of my fellow commissioners. I think we've seen evidence and heard testimony of differing opinions about the historical ecology and presence of wetlands, the current presence of wetlands. I think we've seen ample evidence of that in terms of photographs and observations from qualified experts on the case. I think in the issue of the zoning, given that the proposed project plans are called vehicle inventory storage, I'm compelled to agree with Ms. Usher that in looking at the allowable zoning in the A1 zone, does not seem to allow automobile storage areas. And there might be conditions for that, but it seems to me like the overriding concern here is, and I think it's ultimately the most important thing, is to recognize that we are in the coastal zone of California, and that is the overriding legislation and standard of review. And we have clearly seen evidence that this is a project that intends to fill wetlands and have a direct impact on the existing hydrology of wetlands, and therefore it is not allowed in the coastal zone, and there is no mitigation. So I think that I think that the planning department err and abuse their discretion in determining that this project had no impacts and in the approval of the revised MND.
Okay. Having said that, do we have a motion?
Waltz Morocco, I'll try. Hopefully my fellow commissioners will chime in. This is item number 5, case number ZA 2016-248, CU, CDP, ZAA 1A, environmental case ENV 216-249, MND. So I move to grant the appeal and overturn the zoning administrator's determination to approve a conditional use to allow public parking in the A zone, a coastal development permit for the project, a zoning administrator's adjustment to allow a 9-foot 3-inch tall wall along the southerly side yard setback and move the maximum permitted in height of 6 feet. I'd like to make a finding that, and again, City Attorney, help me if I go off track, that this is in violation of the Coastal Act 30233, which prohibits diking, filling, or dredging of any wetland. It's in violation of the Coastal Act 30240B, which talks about degrading adjacent sensitive habitats and areas, specifically the Belonia wetlands. Coastal Act Chapter 30242, which talks about converting land that is suitable for agriculture to a non-agricultural use. There's been no evidence in the materials that I've seen that an agricultural use is not feasible here. I'd also like to state that the findings for conditional use were not adequate and that the project will not enhance the built environment in the surrounding neighborhood, and it will not perform a function or provide a service that is essential or beneficial to the community. This parking lot is basically for use of Toyota, and while some of the mitigating factors that they were planning on doing, it does not serve the community in any way other than just to support the Toyota dealership. I feel like taking down trees also degrades the, and that's the next one, sorry me. Let me just leave the environmental, sorry. That's good. And then the project's location, size, height, operations, and other significant features will not be compatible, and it will adversely affect or further degrade adjacent properties, surrounding neighborhoods, or public health and welfare and safety, meaning that if you build a parking lot and you're paving over a wetland, you're going to be changing the environment, you're going to be taking down trees, and that will affect the people who live very close to this area. I'm happy to have any other additions to that from my board.
Commissioner Margulies, I would also argue with finding number 3, the project substantially conforms to the purpose, intent, and provisions of the general plan and applicable community plan and any specific plan. I find the proposal of this project to be counter to the general plan's policies and issues and policies related to enhancing the natural environment. And in terms of, I just want to add on a little bit to your, this is both the coastal conformance with Chapter 3 of the Coastal Act and whether this adds to public benefit. It's interesting that what the finding asks us to look at is whether it enhances the built environment. It's very interesting that we're not asked to evaluate whether the project enhances the natural environment. And that, I think, is something to think about, in our updates to community plans and general plans.
Good point.
It makes an assumption that development is what is valued, and habitat and the natural and nature and things that will help us to adapt to climate change have no value. So, City Attorney, you're going to tell me that I can't argue with the standard, but that's okay.
Motion
Yes.
pending.
Yeah.
You had an error that you found with respect to finding number 3. Let's restate that cleanly.
Yes.
You can adopt it.
I will.
Commissioner Waltz Morocco,
Yes.
and then we can go ahead and see if we have a second.
Should may also just to make me streamline things a little bit, you could incorporate the conversation and discussion during your deliberation from all your fellow commissioners by reference into your motion, including the findings that the commission finds that there is substantial evidence of a fair argument and that an EIR is required here as well. There was substantial discussion amongst the commissioners during deliberation about that as well.
You just saved me my finding. Thank you.
I would like to add that to my motion, that the conversation within our commissioners would be included in this, as well as the fair argument that an EIR is probably required.
Okay, so by inclusion, we have a motion by Commissioner Waltz Morocco. Do we have a second?
I would second that in a minute.
I hear you.
Margulies, thank you for letting me do that.
Okay, wonderful. Ms. Lamas, we'll take a vote.
Cecilia Lamas, CEA. We have a first and second on the floor. Commissioner Waltz Morocco, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Margulies, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Roseman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Newhouse, how do you vote?
Aye.
And the motion carries.
Thank you very much, everybody.